Racist cop pulls gun on black woman to laughs at her DEA badge. Minutes later, she's the one in cuffs. Have you ever found yourself at a crossroads, questioning everything you thought you knew, wondering how things could go from perfect to falling apart so quickly? Well, that's exactly what happened to a man named David. Just 1 year ago, he was living a life many could only dream of. A thriving career, a loving family, and a future that seemed bright with endless possibilities. But everything changed in the blink of an eye. What happened to David, you ask? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will not only surprise you, but it might just change the way you think about success, failure, and everything in between. Before we dive in, though, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know what time zone you're in as we begin this incredible story together. Trust me, this journey is one you won't want to miss. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet Midwestern town, but what happened next would shake the streets to their core. Picture this: John Harris, a 65-year-old man standing alone on the sidewalk. His weathered face was calm, his eyes scanning the world around him. A bottle of water in his hand, he wasn't in a hurry, just taking in the day. People passed by, lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the man standing among them. But then everything changed. Tyler Granite, a young police officer no older than 28, walked up to John, tired, frustrated, and clearly carrying the weight of his own battles. The moment he locked eyes with John, something shifted in him. He didn't see an elderly man standing there. He saw a figure to be moved. Without a word, Tyler's voice cut through the air, harsh and commanding. "Move along, old man." John didn't respond immediately. Maybe it was the age gap. Maybe it was the exhaustion Tyler felt from years of dealing with the streets. But in that moment, something snapped. Tyler's hand shot out, not in a gesture of help, but to shove. John stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but before he could react, Tyler's fist collided with his face, sending John crashing to the ground. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed through the street. The onlookers froze. The tension in the air was suffocating. Some stared in disbelief, others too scared to intervene. A man old enough to be Tyler's father now lying on the ground, blood trickling from his lips. How had it come to this? How had the power in this situation been so brutally misused? This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a reminder of how easily authority can be abused. A chilling demonstration of how one moment of unchecked power can change everything. What was the cost of this interaction? What had been lost in the heat of a single decision? And more importantly, who would stand up when things like this happened? John Harris was more than just a man standing on the sidewalk. His life was a tapestry of moments woven with a passion for justice, a commitment to kindness, and a deep-seated belief in the power of change. But no one walking past him that day knew the full story. They saw an elderly man, a face that looked tired, perhaps worn by the years. But beneath the surface, John's legacy was far from ordinary. To truly understand who John was, we must first take a step back and listen to the words of his old friend Malcolm, a former colleague from the days when John was part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It was Malcolm who first told me about John's journey, his quiet but unwavering dedication to a cause greater than himself. John wasn't always the man who stood in silence on the streets of this small town. Once, he was a voice of hope, a beacon of change. In the days when racial tensions were at their peak, when segregation still had its grip on society, John was right there, marching with the brave souls who believed in equality, in freedom, in justice. He stood tall with those who risked everything for a future they couldn't yet see, but one they knew was worth fighting for. He wasn't the loudest voice in the crowd, but his presence was felt. He was one of the quiet leaders, the ones who didn't need a microphone to be heard. He spoke through his actions, through his sacrifice, and through the community he helped build. John wasn't just fighting for civil rights. He was building a community. In the early 70s, after the movement had gained significant ground, John set out to do something that would become one of the most important achievements of his life. He was one of the first to establish a charity in this city, one aimed at helping the homeless. A group of individuals who, like him, had been forgotten by society, pushed to the fringes and ignored. John, however, saw them. He saw their humanity, and he believed they deserved more than just pity, they deserved a chance. Through his charity, John did what so many others wouldn't. He didn't just offer food and shelter, he offered dignity. He helped people rebuild their lives, gave them a sense of worth, and above all, reminded them that they were still part of this world no matter how invisible society tried to make them. John's name wasn't written on billboards or plastered across newspapers. His work wasn't flashy, and there were no grand ceremonies or rewards. But the impact he made was undeniable. Fast forward to today, and John is still here, a silent figure in the background. His contributions largely overlooked by the hustle and bustle of a society that moves too quickly to recognize the importance of the quiet warriors. In the years since, as the world has moved forward, John's charity has continued its work, helping countless men and women find a path back to dignity. Yet despite his tireless work, despite the respect and love he has earned from those who know him, John's story is rarely told. The world has forgotten him, or perhaps more accurately chosen to ignore him. It's easy to forget the quiet contributors, the ones who never sought fame or attention, the ones who worked behind the scenes to change the world in ways that aren't always visible. But John's story is the story of countless others, those who shape communities, who fight for justice, not in the spotlight, but in the everyday actions that make a real difference. These unsung heroes are the bedrock of any society, and it is they who often create the most lasting change. But as we've seen, the world tends to focus on the loud, the controversial, and the flashy. In the rush for the next headline, we forget about the ones who are already quietly building the future brick by brick. It's a tragedy that people like John, who have given so much of themselves to better the lives of others, are left to fade into the background. And yet, even in this moment, even in his old age, John Harris is still fighting against the forces of time, fighting against a society that has forgotten him, and fighting for the very people he has always cared about. It's a fight that might not make the news, but it's a fight that's far more important than any headline. John Harris is a reminder that the real heroes are often the ones who are never celebrated, and that perhaps is the greatest tragedy of all. Tyler Grant was only 28 years old when his name became known for all the wrong reasons. Just 3 years into the force, wearing the uniform with pride, but not yet with wisdom, Tyler was the kind of officer many departments hope to shape: strong, confident, assertive. But behind those polished boots and the sharp gaze was a young man raised on a flawed foundation. Tyler wasn't born cruel. He was taught by a man who believed he was preparing his son for a dangerous world. His father, Alan Grant, had worn the same badge decades earlier, patrolling the same streets. But Alan's teachings didn't include compassion. He didn't believe in restraint. Power, Alan used to say, only means something if people fear it. Those words weren't just advice, they were doctrine, and Tyler took them to heart. Growing up in a small town with an undercurrent of racial tension, Tyler was never encouraged to question what he heard at home. He wasn't exposed to stories outside his own. The media his family consumed painted a narrow, often distorted view of the world, where threats were always lurking, and control was the solution. By the time Tyler entered the academy, his worldview was already hardened, framed by suspicion, fueled by generational bitterness. He excelled in training, especially in tactical response, but emotional intelligence, listening skills, cultural awareness, those were footnotes in his education. And Tyler wasn't looking for empathy, he was looking for order. In his early days on the job, Tyler's reports were clean. He followed procedures, he handled traffic stops and domestic disputes with efficiency. But quietly, slowly, something was building inside him. An impatience, a feeling that things weren't moving fast enough, that the people he was supposed to protect didn't always deserve protection, especially those who didn't look like him. He wouldn't say it aloud. Maybe he couldn't even admit it to himself, but it lived there in his silence, in the tension behind his eyes when a call came in from the wrong part of town. The day Tyler confronted John Harris, it wasn't just about enforcing a sidewalk ordinance. It was a culmination, a breaking point. Tyler had been working a double shift. He was tired, frustrated. Another call about a loitering complaint. He arrived expecting resistance. He arrived ready for a confrontation. And when John didn't move fast enough, didn't respond with the fear, Tyler expected something inside him snapped. It wasn't just about John anymore. It was about every unspoken resentment, every ingrained belief, every time Tyler had felt powerless in his own life. He struck out not because he was in danger, but because he could. That one moment, just a few seconds, would change everything. John lay on the ground, blood on the concrete, bystanders in shock. And Tyler, his hands shook. Not from regret, not yet, but from adrenaline. From the sudden realization that this wasn't training. This wasn't a drill. He'd crossed a line he might never step back from. Tyler's department placed him on administrative leave. Internal Affairs launched an investigation. The public outcry was swift and fierce. And Tyler, who once walked with the confidence of someone backed by the system, now found himself alone. For the first time, he had to face the reality that authority without accountability is just violence. And power, when unchecked, becomes a threat, not a shield. In the weeks that followed, Tyler began to see his own story unravel. Journalists uncovered details about his father's disciplinary record, allegations of excessive force, racially charged remarks, things the department had buried. Suddenly, the myth of the noble cop legacy Tyler had inherited didn't shine so bright. His heroes had feet of clay, and Tyler, he was no exception. Compare Tyler to someone like Norman Oliver, a fictional but iconic figure in law enforcement known for his unwavering empathy and his ability to de-escalate the most volatile situations with nothing but calm words and open eyes. Norman wasn't weak, he wasn't soft, he was strong in a different way. Strong in listening, in seeing the humanity in everyone, even when they were at their worst. He understood that justice isn't about control, it's about service, about trust. Tyler had never learned that. Not in his home, not in his training, and certainly not in the field. He was a product of a broken system, a system that rewards aggression over understanding, that mistakes compliance for peace, and that too often sees compassion as a liability. But Tyler wasn't beyond redemption. He was young, and the pain of what he'd done began to creep in, slowly, quietly, in the sleepless nights, in the messages he received, in the face of John Harris etched into his memory. He started reading, watching documentaries, talking to people in the community. He sat in on town halls where his name was cursed, his actions dissected. And he listened. It wasn't easy. It shouldn't have been. But for the first time in his life, Tyler wasn't defending himself. He was learning. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand the full weight of what he'd done. There are no clean endings in stories like this. No perfect resolutions. Tyler's career was forever scarred. John's body would carry the bruise of that moment long after the headlines faded. But somewhere in the aftermath, in the debris of a shattered illusion, there was a seed, a chance for change. Not just for Tyler, but for the system that made him. And maybe that's the point, that we don't just ask what went wrong with Tyler Grant. We ask why there are so many like him, and what it would take to build a world where men like John Harris are honored, not harmed, where power means responsibility, and where no one is forgotten. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon, just past lunch. The streets buzzed with everyday life, cars passing, distant laughter, the occasional honk, until everything stopped. There on the corner of Elm and Fifth, a man lay on the pavement, blood trickling from the side of his mouth. A younger man in uniform stood above him, hands still trembling, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. And around them, silence, ominous. Dozens of eyes, dozens of witnesses. Not a single voice spoke out. A college student named Maya stood only a few feet away. She had just come out of a nearby bookstore, iced coffee in hand. She heard Ray's voices, turned and saw it unfold. Her first instinct wasn't to run or shout. It was to record. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out her phone, and hit record. Her fingers were shaking. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what else to do. She didn't know if yelling would help. She didn't know if she'd be safe, so she watched and filmed and said nothing. Behind her, an older couple stood frozen. The man reached out slightly as if about to move forward, but his wife pulled his arm gently and whispered, "Don't, it's not our fight." A delivery driver leaned on his bike, frowning but unmoving. A woman on a bench clutched her purse tighter. No one screamed. No one stepped in. No one called for help. The crowd stood still, witnesses to violence, unwilling participants in silence. And here's the hard truth. This kind of silence isn't rare. It happens in cities, in small towns, on subway platforms, in high school cafeterias. It happens when fear outweighs courage, when people worry more about their own safety than someone else's pain. It happens when we convince ourselves that someone else will do something, that it's not our place, that we don't have the power. But every moment of inaction adds up. Every silence becomes a vote for the status quo. In psychology, they call it the bystander effect. The more people who witness an emergency, the less likely it is that any one person will step forward. We look around searching for a leader, hoping someone else will move first. And when no one does, we fold back into ourselves. We shrink. We stay silent, just like they did that day. Maya later posted the video online. It went viral within hours. Thousands watched. Thousands were outraged. But none of them had been there. None of them had felt the weight of that silence pressing down on their chest. Maya didn't post the clip out of pride. She did it because she couldn't sleep. Because the image of John Harris's face hitting the concrete wouldn't leave her. Because in her silence, she felt complicit. Her comments were filled with questions like, why didn't you do something? Why didn't anyone help? And she didn't have an answer. Only shame. But Maya wasn't alone. Throughout history, silence has followed injustice like a shadow. In '91, Rodney King was brutally beaten by police officers in Los Angeles, while several people stood nearby. One man, George Holliday, recorded the footage that would shock the nation. But even then, no one physically intervened. The fear was too real. The consequences too unknown. People ask why. The better question might be, why do we keep letting this happen? Because silence isn't neutral. It protects the aggressor, it isolates the victim, and it teaches the next bystander that silence is acceptable, that looking away is enough. But what if instead one person had shouted, what if someone had stepped in, not with violence, but with presence, with words, with witnesses? What if Maya had said, stop loud enough to break the tension? Would Tyler's hand have paused? Would the outcome have changed? We'll never know. But we do know this silence didn't save John Harris. It didn't stop the bleeding. It didn't stop the trauma. And it didn't challenge the system that allowed this to happen. Imagine if during the Rodney King incident, more people had spoken up before the cameras, before the headlines, before the verdict. Imagine if crowds had been taught not just by their conscience, but by their community, that stepping in is a duty, not a risk. Change might have come sooner. Lives might have been spared. And justice might have been more than a courtroom drama. We're not blaming the crowd, not entirely. The fear is real. The danger is real. But that doesn't mean we get to give up our humanity. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite it. And the truth is, courage is contagious. One voice can spark 10. One hand reaching out can open a floodgate. But it has to start somewhere. So next time you see injustice, remember that moment. Remember the silence. Remember Maya's trembling hands in the weight of her regret. Remember John Harris lying alone. And ask yourself, what would I do? What will I do? Because silence is not an option. Not anymore. Not when lives are on the line. Not when justice depends on presence, on witness, on action. We don't need heroes. We just need people willing to care out loud. People willing to interrupt the violence, to break the silence, to remind the world that dignity is not optional, that humanity is everyone's responsibility. And if we can do that, if we can find the strength to speak when it matters most, then maybe, just maybe, the next John Harris won't be alone on the sidewalk. Maybe someone will stand beside him. And maybe that small act will change everything. Tyler Grant sat alone in the locker room. The tile floor beneath him felt colder than usual. His heart hadn't stopped pounding since the moment he stepped away from the scene. His knuckles were still red, not from a struggle, but from a mistake. A catastrophic one. He couldn't get the image out of his head. John Harris lying there motionless, blood on his lip, eyes staring back in silent disbelief. It wasn't just the look of pain. It was the betrayal. And Tyler felt it like a weight pressing down on his chest, refusing to lift. He hadn't even filed his report when the call came in. Chief Wallace wanted to see him immediately. Tyler walked into the office expecting the usual scolding, a warning, maybe a write-up. But what he got was something else entirely. Wallace didn't yell. He didn't even look angry. He looked tired. and deeply disappointed. He pushed a folder across the desk. "Do you know who you put in the hospital?" Tyler shook his head slowly, his throat dry. That man, that was John Harris, civil rights leader, veteran, founder of the Midwest Outreach Initiative. "You didn't just hit an old man, Tyler, you hit a legend." The words didn't register at first. John Harris? That name felt familiar. Too familiar. Tyler sat down confused, reaching for the folder. Inside were photographs, black and white snapshots of marches, protests, community drives. There was a letter framed in a newspaper clipping signed by a former president praising John for his lifetime of dedication to justice and compassion. Tyler flipped through pages of citations, awards, testimonials from city leaders, pastors, even former police chiefs. His hands started to shake. He had attacked someone who had once risked his life fighting for the very ideals Tyler had sworn to uphold. And it hit him like a truck. He hadn't just lost his temper. He hadn't just overreacted. He had violated the oath, betrayed the badge, and in doing so destroyed not just a man's dignity, but his own integrity. The silence in the room felt deafening. It was the kind of realization that doesn't come with a simple apology. It sits inside you, spreads like ink through water. It rewrites how you see yourself. Tyler had always believed he was a good guy. Misunderstood, maybe. Overworked, definitely. But deep down, he thought he was trying to do the right thing. But now, how could he claim that? How could he look in the mirror knowing he'd struck a man who had marched with Dr. King, who had spent decades feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, defending the voiceless? How do you justify that? And this isn't just Tyler's story, it's a warning about how easy it is to let bias become action, how a moment of unchecked emotion can unravel years of legacy. Tyler wasn't a monster. He was a man raised in a household where fear was passed down like family silver. His father taught him to expect trouble, to assume guilt, to treat resistance as threat. And that belief planted early had festered, until one day it bloomed in the form of a punch. Now the world knew. The media ran with the story. Local hero assaulted by police. Protesters gathered. Hashtags trended. But behind the noise, Tyler faced something much worse than public scrutiny. He faced truth. He faced himself. And this isn't unprecedented. Think of Darren Wilson, the officer who shot Michael Brown in Ferguson. That incident didn't just change a life. It sparked a national movement, a reckoning, a conversation about race, power, and justice. Tyler's case echoed those same questions. How do we train our officers not just physically but morally? How do we teach restraint, empathy, history? And what do we do when someone fails? Tyler wasn't just a man who lost control. He became a symbol of what happens when control is never properly taught, when the uniform gives cover to unresolved anger, when fear overrides training. He became a lesson in what it means to forget that the people you're sworn to protect are people, with stories, with scars, with value. But this story also asks something of us. Can a man like Tyler change? Should he be allowed to? Should one moment define his entire life just as his moment defined John's? These are hard questions, uncomfortable ones, but they matter. Because accountability isn't about vengeance. It's about truth, about consequences, about reflection, and maybe, just maybe, about redemption. Tyler didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He went home and read everything he could find on John Harris, watched interviews, listened to speeches. He sat on his couch wrapped in guilt and heard John's voice from an old radio broadcast saying, "Our fight is not against people. It's against ignorance, against the walls we build when we stop listening to each other." Tyler listened and cried. He knew the damage was done. No apology could undo the impact of his fist. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to honor what John stood for by confronting his own darkness, by unlearning what he thought was strength and replacing it with courage, the kind that doesn't strike but listens, the kind that doesn't dominate but serves. This chapter of the story ends in a hospital room with John Harris unconscious and Tyler Grant outside the door, not as an officer but as a broken man, waiting, hoping for a second chance, not from the world, but from the man he failed. And maybe if John wakes up, maybe there's still time to write a new ending. At the precinct, silence speaks louder than sirens. Ever since the footage surfaced, the air inside the department has changed. Some avoid Tyler in the hallways. Others slap him on the back and whisper, "You did what you had to do." But most just keep their distance. There's an invisible line now cutting through the locker room, the break room, the morning briefings. And Tyler stands in the middle of it, half supported, half shunned, fully alone. Officer Rachel Mendez, a 10-year veteran known for her no-nonsense attitude and community outreach efforts, was the first to say something out loud. "You crossed a line, Tyler," she said, her voice low but firm in front of a group of officers. "We don't hit people who aren't a threat. That's not policing. That's power unchecked." Her words hung heavy in the air, but no one challenged her, not then, not directly. But in the locker room later, Tyler overheard two officers' guys he'd shared shifts and beers with mocking Rachel. "She's gone soft. Always siding with the damn public." They weren't whispering, they didn't care if he heard. And that's when Tyler realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a system tearing at its seams. Captain Mills called a department-wide meeting a few days after the incident. The conference room was packed. Some came in with arms crossed, ready to defend one of their own. Others sat stiffly, eyes forward, hoping anyone would say what they were thinking. The captain stood at the front, gray hair, pulled back, sleeves rolled up. He didn't sugarcoat it. What happened last week wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of judgment, of training, of character. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "And we're not going to fix it by pretending it didn't happen." The room was quiet. Then Officer Blake chimed in. With all due respect, Sir Grant did what he thought was necessary. The man was loitering, uncooperative. "We're not social workers, we're cops. Sometimes things get rough." Rachel snapped back before the captain could. Being rough doesn't mean being reckless. That man was elderly, nonviolent. And now he's in the hospital because one of us couldn't control himself. Blake shot her a look. "So we just stand there and wait to be attacked?" "Oh," she said, her voice rising. "We think, we pause, we de-escalate. That's our job. That's what separates us from chaos." It wasn't just a debate, it was a fracture. And it mirrored a much bigger divide brewing across the country. The thin blue line isn't just about unity anymore, it's about silence, about complicity. And more officers like Rachel are refusing to stay silent. Tyler, for his part, didn't speak during the meeting. What could he say? The weight of his own actions was already too much to carry, but what cut deepest wasn't the criticism, it was the support. The officers who defended him blindly without question, who cheered for him like it was a win, like brutality was a badge of honor. That kind of loyalty wasn't comfort, it was poison, and he could feel it spreading. Later in the squad car with his longtime partner, Officer Dean Radley, Tyler finally asked the question that had been burning in his chest. "Do you think I screwed up?" Dean kept his eyes on the road for a moment too long. Then with a slow exhale, he said, "Yeah, I do. But I also think we've all been close to that edge. You just went over it." Tyler didn't respond, because deep down he knew Dean was right. These tensions are not unique to one department. They reflect a nationwide struggle within law enforcement. A culture where questioning your colleague can be seen as betrayal. Where the pressure to conform is stronger than the courage to confront. Where the line between justice and force gets blurred day by day, badge by badge. Across the country, departments are grappling with the same questions. What do we do with officers who cross the line? How do we rebuild trust, not just with the public, but within our own ranks? And how do we create a culture where accountability isn't a threat, but a promise? Some departments have started holding peer review panels. Others are implementing empathy training, community-led oversight boards, and strict body cam policies. But change doesn't come easy in a structure built on loyalty and tradition. It takes voices like Rachel's. It takes silence from people like Tyler to finally break. It takes moments like these. For Tyler, the hardest part wasn't losing respect. It was realizing who gave it to him in the first place. The ones who praised him were the loudest, yes, but also the most disconnected. The ones who saw the badge as armor, not responsibility. The ones who celebrated fear over restraint. And he couldn't unsee that. The real question now wasn't whether he would face suspension or disciplinary action or even public outrage. It was deeper. It was whether he'd let this moment define him or change him, whether he'd keep pretending this was just a mistake or admit it was a mirror, showing him who he really was and who he could still become. Back in the break room, someone left a newspaper on the table. Front page community icon assaulted. Below it, a photo of John Harris smiling with a child on each side. Tyler stared at it. Not the headline, not the outrage, but the smile, the legacy, the reminder that real strength is measured not by control, but by compassion. And sitting there between Rachel's conviction and Blake's bravado, between silence and noise, Tyler finally understood. The force he carried on his hip meant nothing if he couldn't carry the weight of what it meant to wear the badge. It started with a flicker, a single post, a shaky vertical video uploaded by a college student named Marcus, who happened to be standing just a few feet away when Tyler Grant struck John Harris. At first, the clip sat quietly on his feed. No captions, no edits, just raw, unfiltered reality. A man standing still, a uniformed officer shouting, a sudden blow, and an old man crumpling to the pavement. But within hours, that silence exploded into a storm. By midnight, the video had been shared over 10,000 times. By morning, that number tripled. Hashtags began trending, had justice for John Tan, not one more. This is why we kneel. Twitter feeds flooded with outrage. Instagram reels looped the hit on repeat, spliced with quotes from civil rights leaders. TikTok creators narrated frame-by-frame breakdowns, adding somber music and urgent voiceovers. And on Facebook, where John's generation lives, community groups shared stories about the man behind the bloodied face. In a matter of hours, John Harris had gone from a faceless victim to a national symbol. Not because he sought it, not because he spoke up, but because someone hit record, and the internet did the rest. News outlets caught wind fast. Local papers picked it up, then regional affiliates, then national giants. Morning shows debated the clip in real time. Experts chimed in arguing policy psychology and the ethics of force. A clip, less than 30 seconds long, had sparked a conversation centuries in the making. At City Hall, the mayor called an emergency press conference. With reporters swarming the steps, he called the footage deeply disturbing and vowed a full investigation. Behind him, the police chief stood stone-faced, promising transparency while carefully sidestepping blame. But the internet wasn't waiting. Justice had gone viral. And with every repost, every comment, every reaction, the pressure mounted. Tyler's name was out. So was his photo. The internet has a way of digging fast, brutal, and unforgiving. People unearthed his high school yearbook, his father's disciplinary record as a cop, his deleted tweets. Every piece of his life became fuel for the fire. And while some called it a witch hunt, others called it accountability. Meanwhile, John Harris lay unconscious in a hospital bed, unaware that millions now knew his name. Protesters began to gather outside the precinct. Candlelight vigils formed in front of the hospital. Handwritten signs lined the sidewalk. He deserved better. We see you, John. Respect the elders who fought for our rights. The internet wasn't just angry, it was grieving. And it was organizing. Within days, petitions demanding Tyler's termination reached over 1 million signatures. Civil rights organizations stepped in, offering legal support. Influencers with millions of followers urged their communities to act. Donations poured into a GoFundMe for John's medical bills, exceeding its goal within hours. But beyond the metrics, beyond the headlines, something deeper was shifting. The video hadn't just exposed one act of violence. It had reminded people of every time justice was delayed, dismissed, or denied. It became a mirror, and millions didn't like what they saw. This wasn't the first time a video that had sparked outrage. It wouldn't be the last. From Rodney King in 1991 to George Floyd in 2020, the lens of a camera has often captured what words could not. But what made this moment different was the clarity. No weapons, no threats, just silence, and then impact. Social media, for all its noise and chaos, had once again proven its power. It wasn't just about exposure, it was about momentum, about turning moments into movements, about turning anger into action. But it also raised questions. What happens when outrage outpaces due process? When cancel culture collides with criminal justice, when a single video defines a life for better or worse, for some, Tyler was a villain. For others, a scapegoat. And for a rare few, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without empathy leads to ruin. Debates raged online. Was this justice or a digital lynching? Was Tyler a rogue cop or a symptom of something larger? Through it all, one thing was clear: the world was watching, and silence was no longer an option. For the first time in his life, Marcus, the student who posted the video, was invited to speak on national television. Sitting nervously under studio lights, he simply said, "I didn't do anything heroic. I just hit record. But I think about what would have happened if I hadn't." Would anyone have believed Mr. Harris? Would anything have changed? That question echoed in living rooms across America, in classrooms, in police academies, in churches, in barbershops, in subway cars. It echoed because it was real, because it was honest, because the truth had gone viral. John Harris, once nearly forgotten, had become a voice louder than ever before. Not because he spoke, but because the world finally listened. And as that video continued to loop across timelines and news feeds, something else began to spread. Not just outrage, not just grief, but awareness. A reminder that justice often needs a witness, that silence when shared becomes complicity, and that one recording, one choice can change everything. It began behind closed doors. In a windowless conference room on the third floor of City Hall, under flickering fluorescent lights, a half-dozen city officials sat around a scarred oak table staring at one another in heavy silence. The air was thick with pressure, public, political, and personal. The mayor sat at the head, flanked by the police chief and the city attorney. Nobody spoke first. Everyone waited for someone else to break the ice, because they all knew this wasn't just a use of force inquiry. This was a crisis, a PR disaster, a moral reckoning, and it had the full attention of the nation. The city's internal affairs unit had already begun their preliminary investigation. They'd reviewed the viral video from every angle, interviewed Tyler's immediate supervisors, gathered statements from officers who'd been on duty that day. But everyone understood this wasn't just about policy violations. It was about public trust, or more accurately, the collapse of it. The police chief, a veteran of 30 years with gray streaks in his temples, finally leaned forward. "We can't protect him," he said quietly, referring to Officer Tyler Grant. "Not this time." Across the table, the union rep stiffened. "So what are you suggesting? We throw one of our own under the bus because a bunch of keyboard warriors are screaming online." The mayor didn't flinch. "We're not throwing anyone under anything. We're responding to a community that's rightfully furious. A man with a decorated past was assaulted in broad daylight by someone wearing our badge. We owe this city more than silence." Voices rose. Tensions cracked. Legal risks were discussed in hushed tones. Media strategies were tossed back and forth. The phrase optics came up again and again, as though this were all about appearance. But beneath it, a deeper fear churned. If they didn't act decisively, this city could burn like others had before it. Outside that room, the pressure kept building. Protesters marched daily. Civil rights groups demanded transparency. National news vans parked in front of City Hall like vultures circling a wounded animal. John Harris had become a symbol, and symbols carried weight. Under this mounting scrutiny, the city launched a formal investigation led by an independent oversight board. It was supposed to signal fairness, impartiality, integrity. But to many citizens, it felt like a delay tactic. Another committee, another report, another way to stall the justice they'd been denied too many times before. Meanwhile, within the department, morale fractured. Some officers believed Tyler had crossed a line and damaged the badge they wore. Others felt betrayed, angry that leadership wasn't backing their own. The break room became a battleground of whispers. Officers who once worked side by side now stood on opposite sides of an invisible line. The city's PR team scrambled to calm the storm. Press releases were carefully worded. The mayor gave interviews promising accountability while avoiding specifics. The police department launched a community engagement initiative trying to recenter the narrative. But no amount of messaging could erase the image of an elderly man lying motionless on the sidewalk. In one particularly tense city council meeting, packed wall to wall with angry citizens, a young woman stepped to the mic during public comment. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with fury. "You keep telling us to wait for the report, for the findings, for the full context. But we saw the video. We know what happened. You want us to trust a system that's failed us again and again. Why should we believe you now?" The room erupted in applause. Not just polite claps, roaring, standing, cathartic applause. Because she had said what so many felt, that justice delayed feels like justice denied. And behind the scenes, more complexity unraveled. Whistleblowers emerged from within the department. Anonymous tips claimed Tyler had previous complaints, none of which had led to serious consequences. An old incident report surfaced detailing a confrontation eerily similar to what had happened with John Harris. It was dismissed at the time, labeled unsubstantiated. But now every decision made to protect Tyler back then was coming back to haunt them. The Oversight Board's investigation soon faced its own controversy. One of the appointed members had a history of defending police misconduct in court. Activists demanded he step down. He didn't. Another member received threats from pro-police extremists. She nearly quit. The board was unraveling before it could even finish its job. The deeper they dug, the more obvious it became. This wasn't just about one officer and one victim. It was about a broken system with policies that shielded misconduct unions, that discouraged accountability, and leaders too afraid to lead. Parallels were quickly drawn. Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, names that had become rallying cries. Cases where the initial promise of investigation gave way to disappointment. Would John Harris be another name on that list? Pressure mounted on the state level. The governor made a statement, vague but supportive. Federal agencies expressed interest in reviewing the case. National civil rights attorneys hinted they might take on John's representation. Everything was escalating, fast. And in the middle of it all, John's family broke their silence. His daughter Vanessa appeared on television, composed but resolute. "My father marched in Selma. He fed people the city forgot. He never asked for thanks. But now he deserves justice, not behind a closed door, not in a private report. Out here where everyone can see it." It was a turning point. Her words, delivered with quiet strength, struck a nerve. Donations surged, petitions surged, and the mayor knew the clock had run out. So they called a press conference. Under the glare of cameras, with the city watching, the mayor announced that Officer Tyler Grant would be placed on unpaid suspension pending further disciplinary review, that the independent investigation would be made public, that policy reforms would begin immediately, including new de-escalation training and an audit of all past misconduct complaints. It was something, but to many it wasn't enough. Because justice, real justice, isn't just about punishment. It's about acknowledgement, about telling the truth, about rebuilding trust that was never whole to begin with. And as the city braced for what came next, hearings, protests, reckonings, one thing was clear: the people weren't backing down. Not this time. Not when the world was watching. The first march started quietly, a line of neighbors, students, pastors, mothers, pushing strollers, elders with canes moving down Main Street with candles in hand and signs across their chests. Justice for John. Protect our people. We remember. They didn't chant, not at first, just walked, silent, united. The only sounds were footsteps on pavement and the occasional car honk in support. But by the second day, the crowd had doubled. By the end of the week, it filled the streets. Something had shifted. It wasn't just about John Harris anymore. It was about a wound that had never really healed. And now, in this small Midwestern city, the people were done waiting. They stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the courthouse, chanting beneath storm-gray skies. No justice, no peace. The sound echoed off buildings like thunder. Children stood on their parents' shoulders waving flags. Teenagers live-streamed the moment. Local journalists scrambled to keep up. National cameras rolled in. Across town, police officers stood behind metal barricades, helmets on batons at their sides. City officials watched from windows, trying to gauge whether this was still a protest or the beginning of something more volatile. The air was thick with tension. No one wanted a spark. In the days that followed, organizers set up tents in front of City Hall. They called it the People's Watch. Every night they gathered for open mic sessions, people from all walks of life sharing their stories of mistreatment, silent survival. A mother spoke of her son being stopped for matching a description while walking home from work. A retired teacher cried, recalling how she taught John Harris back in the 60s and how proud she was of the man he became. The energy was raw, but it wasn't just anger, it was purpose. Demands were clear. Officer Tyler Grant must be terminated and criminally charged. The police department must audit all previous complaints. Independent community oversight must be given power to act. And most of all, the city must acknowledge the harm done not just to John Harris, but to every person who ever felt invisible here. The mayor addressed the crowd on the seventh day. Standing on a makeshift stage, she tried to speak over chants. "I hear you," she said, "and I know. Words are not enough. But we are listening. We are working." Boos drowned her out. People had heard promises before. Now they wanted proof. That same night, a larger protest formed at the edge of the city near the police precinct. This one wasn't candlelight and silence. It was fists in the air, booming voices, drums beating like hearts on fire. Someone climbed a streetlight to hang a banner, "Justice is not optional." Riot gear was deployed. Helicopters buzzed overhead. It was teetering on the edge of confrontation. But still, no one backed down. Not even when the city imposed a curfew. Not even when arrests began. Not even when tear gas was threatened. Because something deeper held them there. A belief that if they walked away now, the story would fade. The system would reset. And John Harris would become another footnote. Another unfortunate incident. Another name whispered in past tense. So they stayed. They marched during the day. They watched at night. College students skipped finals to organize voter registration booths. Churches offered sanctuary and first aid. Local businesses donated food and water. There were disagreements, yes. Moments where rage outpaced strategy, but the heartbeat of the movement never stopped. And beyond the city, support kept building. Messages poured in from across the country. Civil rights groups sent legal teams. Celebrities tweeted in solidarity. One national news host called it a new Selma. The comparison wasn't taken lightly, but it was fitting. Because just like Selma in 1965, this movement wasn't just about one injustice. It was about the wall of silence that had surrounded that injustice for too long. Protesters invoked that history often. They quoted John Lewis. They wore T-shirts with MLK's face in the words "not done yet." And when older activists from the civil rights era came to speak, there were tears bridging generations. One man who'd marched with Dr. King put it best. "What you're doing here, this is what democracy looks like." But for all the progress, pushback remained. Conservative media outlets framed the protests as unrest. State politicians called for law and order. Anonymous threats targeted protest leaders. Some donors pulled out from nonprofits aligned with the movement. The backlash was loud, calculated, relentless. Still they marched. On the 20th day, a massive march was planned. Thousands converged downtown. Schools let out early. City buses ran for free. Drones captured overhead shots of a crowd that looked like a living river of resistance. At its center marched Vanessa Harris John's daughter, carrying a photo of her father as a young man at a civil rights rally in 1964. She stopped midway, turned to the cameras and said, "My father never stopped believing in this country, even when it failed him. We're not here to burn it down. We're here to rebuild it better, fairer, safer for everyone." And that was the moment. The crowd fell silent, not out of awe, but recognition that this wasn't just a protest. It was a promise, a line drawn in history, a city refusing to forget. Because when people stand up together, systems shake, walls crack, change begins. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't violence or vengeance. It's visibility. It's unity. It's a community saying, "We see what you did. We see who you hurt. And we're not leaving until justice sees us back." The courtroom was packed, not with lawyers and suits, but with neighbors, with teachers, with veterans, with single moms holding babies on their hips. They weren't there for drama. They weren't even there for revenge. They were there for truth, for something that had been missing for far too long. Tyler sat at the defendant's table. No badge, no uniform, just a man stripped of everything but the weight of his choices. He didn't look up much. Not when the prosecutor laid out the facts, not when the video played again, not even when John Harris, cane in hand, stood and faced him from the witness box. John's voice was steady, his words simple. You hit me like I was nothing. I forgave you, but justice still has a job to do. It was the first time Tyler's eyes met his, and maybe in that moment he saw more than a victim. Maybe he saw a man who stood through the fire of America's past and kept standing even when his own country turned on him again. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. But the real sentence had already started. Tyler had lost his career, his community, his name now attached forever to the wrong side of a story that will be told again and again. And the city once torn by silence began to speak. New policies, new oversight. A new culture inside the police department where rookies now learn the full story of John Harris during training. Not as a warning, but as a legacy. Outside the courthouse, John stood in front of reporters. I didn't want to be a symbol, he said. But if my pain can help protect someone else, then maybe it was worth it. A little girl nearby asked to take a photo with him. He smiled, knelt beside her, looked into the lens not as a victim, but as a survivor, as a reminder. Because stories like his don't end when the headlines fade. They begin again every time we choose truth over comfort. Every time we call out injustice when it shows up in our streets, our schools, our systems. And every time we ask ourselves, if it were me lying on that pavement, would the world care enough to stand up? If you've made it this far, ask yourself that question. And one more, what side of the story will you stand on? Because silence is safe, but justice never is. Subscribe for more stories they don't want you to hear. And remember, the next headline could be your neighbor or your name.